Welcome back, students. Last time, we discussed the idea that species evolve, or change, over time. We discussed Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's attempts to explain evolution and how they were ultimately shown to be incorrect. This provided the opportunity for another scientist, British naturalist Charles Darwin, to propose his own explanation for how species evolve. In 1831, Darwin sailed with the crew of the HMS Beagle on a trip to explore South America. On this trip, Darwin was able to observe hundreds of species in differing habitats all over the world. Darwin was particularly fascinated by his observations of the plants and animals on the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are found off the west coast of South America. If you are looking in your map here, the Galapagos Islands, here's the west coast of South America, and right here are the Galapagos Islands. One of Darwin's most notable observations was that the species on the Galapagos Island, like these cacti, like these cacti here, which are very, very tall, taller than a person. Other organisms like the iguanas here and the tortoises here. When he observed these on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that all of these species varied significantly from their counterparts, the same kinds of species that were on the mainland. In most cases, they were larger and had different structures and some other functional and behavioral adaptations that made them unique from their cousins on the mainland. So, Darwin became curious. How did these species become so different than those 1,000 miles away on the mainland? It was in the Galapagos Islands that Darwin first formulated his ideas about how evolution occurs. The reason that he was able to do this in the Galapagos Islands is because the Galapagos Islands provide a natural model for how species can become very different from one another. There are two features of the Galapagos Islands that make them ideal for studying how species change over time. The first feature is that the Galapagos Islands are geographically separated from one another. In other words, it's difficult to get from one to the other. And thus, if you are a population of organisms on one island, you're essentially stuck there, and you're stuck with the environment on that particular island. The second feature of the Galapagos Islands that make them ideal for studying how species can change over time is that the Galapagos Islands are environmentally diverse. In other words, each of the islands have different weather patterns, different soil types, different levels of sun exposure, different vegetation and plant life, different predators, and so on. None of the islands were exactly like the other. Okay, so when Darwin visited each of these 13 geographically isolated, environmentally diverse islands, he studied the organisms that lived there and noticed that they differed a little bit depending on which island they were living on. Although he studied many organisms, we're going to focus for this section on one particular set of organisms, the finches that Darwin observed. So, when Darwin visited each of the 13 islands, he noticed that the finches on each island were different from each other and different from the mainland finch. You can see that in this diagram here, The finch in the center here is the mainland finch. And the finches that are shown around the mainland finch are the various kinds of finches that were observed on each of the Galapagos Islands. So as you look around this diagram, you can see that not only are the finches different from each other, their beak shapes differ, their head shapes differ, but they're also different from the original mainland finch. So Darwin became very curious and motivated to answer this question. What caused the finches on the different islands to have different beak shapes? As an answer to the question of how the finches on each island became so different from each other, Darwin proposed his idea of natural selection. We're going to highlight that because this term natural selection, oops, hold on, that was a bad highlight. This term natural selection is really the focus of this section. What I'm about to describe to you are 5 different principles that are all part of this idea of natural selection. Okay, so the first principle of natural selection is that there's not enough for everybody. In other words, all the resources that organisms need, like food and water and space, are all in short supply. We call these factors that are in short supply environmental pressures. And because they're in short supply, they cause competition between organisms. If you look to the pictures to the right, you'll see 2 examples of this. So in the top picture, you'll notice that, actually let's do different color so you can see it. You'll notice that there's only one food source or one worm there, but the birds are competing over it. And over in the second picture, with the fish, you'll notice that the fish here and here are competing for safety from the predator over here. Okay, so in both these situations, the birds and the fish are experiencing environmental pressures that cause them to compete with one another. The second principle of natural selection is that variations occur within every population. So we all know at this point that not all members of a species are identical. Some exhibit variations, or in other words, inherited traits that make an individual different from other members of its species. So if we go back to our examples over here, we can see that between the birds and the fish, there are variations that we can observe. So here in the birds, they're very similar, but they do have a variation in beak shape. One has a shorter beak, one has a longer beak. In the fish, the variation is in the color. Some fish are lighter in color, some fish are darker in color. Right? So they're the same species, but each of the individuals of the species may have something that makes it a little bit different from the other members of the species. This leads to the third principle, which is that sometimes variations make an organism better suited to its environment. In other words, the variation makes it easier for the organism to outcompete the others and therefore survive. Any variation that gives an organism a competitive advantage is called an adaptation. So if we go back to the examples of the beaks here, the beak, there are two variations of beak size, short and long, but only one of them is adaptive. Only this version here is going to help the organism survive. And so the long beak in this case would be an adaptation for this particular environment. The same thing down here. Both of these colors that are shown on the fish are variations, but only one of them is an adaptation. That's this one, because this is the one that is going to make the organism more likely to survive because it will camouflage into the coral reef and be less likely to be killed by its predator. Okay, this leads us to the fourth principle, which is that organisms that survive are more likely to reproduce. As a result, the organism's offspring will inherit the adaptation that enabled its parents to survive. In these examples, the long-beaked bird and the dark green fish will survive, and therefore they'll get the opportunity to have long-beaked chicks and dark green fish babies. On the other hand, any organisms that had variations that were not adaptive are less likely to survive and will be less likely to have children inherit their variations. In this example, you'll notice, or we'll notice on Monday when I show you the video, that there are no new short-beaked birds or light green fish. It's because the adaptation of their parents, or I should say the variation of their parents, was not adaptive, and therefore their parents did not survive to make offspring. Finally, the fifth principle is that over time, and when we say over time, we're not talking about months or even years. We're talking about hundreds to thousands to even millions of years. But over time, the offspring of individuals with helpful variations will end up making up more of the population and eventually will even become a separate species. In this example, eventually all the birds in the area will have long beaks, and eventually all the fish will be dark green in color. Okay, that was a lot for today. We will spend much of next week going over many examples of natural selection and how it leads to the evolution of new species. So stay tuned and have a good night.